Hello, welcome to White Dairy Garden and Worm Farm. We are going to be having another worm farming discussion, and today we are going to be looking at insects that you do not want to have in your worm bin. So, how are you guys doing today? Today is Friday, so I'm hoping you're having a good Friday leading into the weekend. I know for most it's exciting when it is Friday because it means at the end of the day they won't have any more work to do for another 2 days. Yes, so there are a lot of insects that can be found in the worm bin, and for the most part, they are not harmful to the worm bin. Most of them are actually beneficial for the worm bin in the sense that they're good composters. So, today, though, what we're going to be looking at is the small amount of insects that can be found in the worm bin that can be harmful, whether to you or to your worms or to your garden. And so let's talk about the harmful ones. And of course, if you know of any harmful insect in the worm bin that I did not mention, then please feel free to share. And if you also would like to share how you get rid of or control those insects, then that would be awesome. Okay, so the first one that I'm going to be mentioning is the red mites, because I think of all the ones that I'm going to be mentioning here, where worms are concerned, these are the worst. Now, not only do red mites compete with your worms for food, but they are harmful to your worms. In fact, they are parasites to the worms. So you don't want to have these in your worm bin. And if you find that you are starting to have red mites in your worm bin, you can soak bread in milk and rest it on the top of your worm bin, and the mites will be attracted to that. And then you can just remove the the bread with the mites on it and keep replacing it until you see the population going down. Now, when you have red mites in large quantities in your worm bin, it is usually an indication that your worm bin is a bit acidic. And so there are several things that you can do to control the acidity of your bin, several things you can use. For one, you don't want to add food that are acidic because that is going to encourage their population to explode. You can add a pH buffer, so dolomite, crushed eggshell, crushed oyster shell, diatomaceous earth, and garden lime. These can be added to neutralize the acidity in the bin. So those are some of the steps that you can take. Neem oil or neem oil cake is very good at eradicating these red mites. So if you have those, then you can add that to your bin, and that works pretty well too. Yeah, so remember the red mites. Once you start to see them in your bin, then you need to act quickly because they are parasites to your worms. Soldier flies, these are considered harmful. Sorry, they're not considered harmful in the worm bin. Their larvae are very good decomposers, and the soldier flies are very good at deterring house flies. Unfortunately, though, they do spread diseases, and that is the reason you don't want them in your worm bin. I know that there are those who raise the soldier fly larvae as composting worms. You just have to be very careful. Make sure you wash your hands after handling them because they do spread diseases. One thing though, if you're raising soldier flies or if you have worm bin and you notice that you're in a region where you might have soldier flies in your worm bin, then you want to ensure that there is no meat in the bin because that is going to attract them and cause them to multiply drastically. So you don't want to have soldier flies in your worm bin for that reason. But of course, as I said before, there are those who raise their larvae for as composting worms, or they raise it to feed pets and stuff like that. So, but just be careful when handling those things because you don't want to end up spreading diseases from them. Now, the third one is the fruit flies. Of course, these are not harmful to the worm bin. I don't know if they had any benefits to the worm bin. They're just there to eat the food, compete with your worms for the food, so you don't want to have them in there. They multiply rapidly and they can be very annoying. They also spread germs. So that is another reason why you do not want to have fruit flies in your worm bin. And then there are those who raise their worms indoors, whether it's in your kitchen, your basement, or a spare room. Now, you don't want these guys to take over your home, and so you have to take the necessary steps to ensure that you do not end up with fruit flies in your garden, or sorry, in your worm bin, because they can take over your home. So there are several. Oh, hi, Han White, how are you? Yeah, so there are several steps that you can take. Oh, you're driving. Okay, just be careful. Okay, you'll be home in 5 minutes. Okay, see you then. Yes, so there are several steps that you can take. Oh, hi, Russell. I haven't seen you in a while. How you doing? Did you get all of those winter prep done? I know it can be so much work preparing for the winter. Yes, so the fruit flies, there are several steps that you can take to ensure that you keep their population down. In fact, try your best not to have any at all because all it takes is two and the population can get out of hand. So if you have your worm bin indoors, okay, you're doing good. Excellent. Yeah, so if you have your worm bin indoors in your home, one of the things that is recommended to keep the fruit flies population down, one, make sure you don't overfeed because the longer the food scrap is there, the more it's going to break down and it becomes sour. When your food scrap is sour, it's going to attract the flies even more. Next thing you want to do is ensure that you bury your food scraps as deeply as you can. If you're able to use a mesh or some form of fabric to cover your worm bin, cover the holes on your worm bin, that will help too. And as Russell taught me recently, you can use the BTK to keep down, or the mosquito dunk, soak in water to keep down the fruit fly population because it will not kill the fruit flies, but then at least it will kill the larvae when they hatch. So you can use those methods to keep the fruit flies population down. Now, centipede is another one that you do not want to have in your worm bin because they prey on worms and they use their venom to incapacitate the worms before they attack them. So there's no escape for the poor little worms. So when you see centipede in your worm bin, you want to get rid of these as quickly as possible. Now, they are not harmful to humans, but they do bite humans. So, again, make sure you remove them if you see them in your worm bin. I know they move pretty fast, and sometimes it can be difficult to catch them. I don't know if there's any other method of getting rid of them apart from removing them when you see them. I usually try to exterminate them as soon as I see them so that I can get them under control. Okay, so the next thing or pest that you don't want to have in your worm bin is snails and slugs. These, of course, they're not harmful to the worms, but then these snails and slugs will lay their eggs in your castings. And then when you use the castings in your garden, you're going to end up with an infestation of snails and slugs eating down your plants. So although they're not harmful to your worms, they're harmful to your garden. And so you want to get these guys under control as quickly as possible. Using a screen might be a very good way of keeping snails and slugs out of your worm bin. Keeping your worm bin elevated off the ground might also be a good way to keep them out. There are baits that you can use too, but I don't really have much experience where snails and slugs in a worm bin is because we don't really have snails and slugs in my region, thankfully. So I don't really know much regarding the worm bin, what you can do to keep them out apart from using the screens and keeping the bin elevated, keeping it covered if you can. And I don't, for baits, I don't know if they are harmful to your worms, so I would not recommend that you put baits inside your worm bin just in case. But you could probably, if you know that you're in a region where you have problems with snails and slugs, then you can set up baits outside of the worm bin that will attract them to that location rather than to your worms. Let's see, Russell says snails and slugs eat worms if not fed other food. Oh, really? Interesting. Didn't know that. See, I learned something else. Wow, that's good to know. I'll keep that in mind. Okay, so as Russell says, the snails and slugs will eat the worm if they don't have any other food source. And then that is the next thing about the snails in your worm bin is that they're going to be competing with your worms for the food that is in the bin. And worms are not like mites and those tiny creatures that can only eat a small amount. Snails and slugs, they can eat a lot. So they will be competing for the food. So we have to try our best to keep them down. And the next thing that you don't want in your worm bin is mice and rats. I don't know if mice eat worms. Some say they do, some say they don't. I know that rats do eat worms. And from my experience of having mice in my worm bin, I cannot say whether or not they're eating my worms, but what I've noticed is that even occasionally I will see bins that does not have any form of food scraps because the bins were fed compost, and I've seen where the rats have entered or the mice has entered those bins. So if there is nothing in there for them to feed on, why are they going in there? So chances are that mice too do eat worms if they don't have anything else available. Rats definitely will eat your worms. So you don't want to have these in your worm bins. They will also have their young ones in your worm bin if you're not tending to your bin quite regularly. And not only that, but they spread germs, serious germs that can cause some severe diseases. So for those reasons, you don't want to have them in your worm bin. So some of the things that you can do to get them under control is to set rat traps or ensure that your bins are properly covered so that they can't get in. Or you can use mesh, hardware cloth, and stuff like that to enclose the area where you have your bins. But whatever step is necessary to ensure that you keep them under control. Okay, let's see. Russell says, I think mice eat food scraps. Moles feast on worms. Okay, yeah. I'm familiar with the term mole, but I don't know what they look like. I've never really seen them. Don't have them in my region, I assume, because I've never seen anything that I'm not familiar with. Yes. But for many, they might have moles around. Yes, but I've noticed that mice sometimes go into my worm bin, even those that doesn't have any food scraps in there. I know definitely if I don't have the worm shelf secured from the mice, even my finished castings that I harvest, because I use the food scraps in a container to extract the hatchlings, the mice will go in there. Yeah, so I try to keep them covered to ensure that I don't have an issue with them, because you don't want to be spreading these diseases to your plants and to yourself. So try to keep them covered. So these are some of the pests and insects that you don't want to have in your worm bin. So do you guys have potworms in your worm bin? And if you have potworms in your worm bins, do you just let them stay, or do you try to get their population under control? These days, I seem to have a lot of potworms in my worm bins. Some bins have more than others. So I've been trying to figure out what it is that is attracting them, because I don't really have acidic food in my worm bins. So I don't know, but I do know that I keep my bin moist, fairly moist, not too moist, but just enough. So I don't know if maybe the moisture is what is attracting them, but I tend to have quite a bit of potworms in my bin. The good thing about potworms in your bin is that they are not harmful to their worms, and they're not harmful to humans either. They are good composters, and they're always present. Even if you don't see them, they're always present. But sometimes they can be present in small quantities, and that is why you don't really see that they're there, or they can be there in large quantities. Most of the time, to know if they're there in large quantities, then just add food scraps to one location, and then you'll find that they gravitate towards the food scraps, and then you'll get to see them. The good thing though is that they like to form little balls, so you can just scoop out the worm ball of them and get rid of them. So how do you get rid of the potworms if you have them in your worm bin? You can get rid of them, like I said, with the red mites. The same method work for potworms, because potworms do love acidic condition, and they like moist, very moist condition as well. So one thing that you can do to get their population under control is to allow your bin to dry out somewhat. Yes, I agree, Russell. Agricultural lime help to keep potworms in check. Yes, so one of the things that you can do is to let the bin dry off somewhat, but you don't want to dry too much to the point where your worms are affected. But then potworms are so tiny that they will most likely die off before your worms do. So allow your bin to dry out somewhat. You can use pH buffer, and there are many different types that you can use to get them under control. Like Russell says, the agricultural lime works pretty well. You can use dolomite, you can use diatomaceous earth, ground eggshell, ground oyster shell. So these will work well in keeping the potworm population under control. And another thing that you can do too is the bread, soak in milk. I don't know what it is about it that these pests like, but they seem to like it. So when you put these on the surface of your bin, they will go on it, and then you just keep repeating You take that out, get rid of it, and you keep repeating the process until you get the worm population under control. Yeah, so, although it is recommended that for worms, they like to have the bin moist enough where it's like a wrung out sponge. Sometimes I find that the potworms seem to think that is good enough moisture for them, so the population grow. So you can either use the pH buffer, and then you don't have to worry about the moisture content too much. You don't want your bin to be soaking wet though. Whether or not you have potworms, you don't want your bin to be soaking wet. But if you are one of those persons who like to water your bin thoroughly and have water dripping out of it, lots of water dripping out of it, then chances are that can encourage the potworm population. And sometimes the food that you're feeding, it does not necessarily have to be acidic for it to make the potworm population grows. That's not necessarily the case because, like I said before, I don't really feed my worms acidic food, but yet still I have a large population of potworms. So it's not necessarily that you have to have, once the potworms are there and food is available, they're going to be reproducing whether it is acidic, yes or no. It's just that the more acidic it is, then the more their population is going to grow. So here is a question for you guys. Do you feed your worms acidic food? I don't really feed my worms acidic food. I try to, when I have acidic food, I create a compost bin just for those. And the reason I don't really put them, sometimes I do, but most times I don't, put the acidic food in my compost bin, not worm bin, but compost bin, is because there are some plants that really like acidic soil. And so I want to ensure that I don't have to purchase um, anything that is going to add acidity to the those plants or to the soil where I'm planting those. So I produce my own, and that is why I have the acidic food in one container and compost it in that container so that I can just add that to the plants, directly to those plants that love acidic environment, rather than having it in all of my compost and making my compost acidic. Let's see, Russell says raw egg and bedding in a bait cup attracts C. elegans. What are C. elegans, Russell? Never heard of that. Yeah, so as I was saying, I don't really feed my worm acidic food. There are occasions when they get acidic food, not intentionally, but inside the home, I have a little container that is my compost bin, or at least that I use to collect the food scraps from the home. And then my kids, everyone in the home knows that if you're eating whatever you're eating that is organic, you're going to be putting the material in there as long as it is not eggshell or any of the undesirables like meat and dairy products. So they know that they are to put it in that container. So they will put just about anything in there, the onions and anything else that is acidic. And sometimes the bin is, you don't really want to be separating them. Sometimes you don't even see that they are in there. So on that account, occasionally my worms will get acidic food, but in general, I don't feed them acidic food. Oh, okay. So I guess that's the scientific name for them. C. elegans. Nematodes are often called potworms. Okay, good to know. Thanks for that. So raw egg and bedding in a bait cup. Hmm. Let me jot that down. Okay, definitely going to be trying that one. Hi, growing my own. How are you? Yes, I'm definitely going to be trying that one, Russell, because it seems sometimes in the worm bin I don't really see a lot of potworms, but then when I harvest the castings and I'm baiting out the worms, that is when I see that there are a lot of potworms in my bins. So definitely I'm going to have to use that method to try and get them under control. Let's see. Um, Russell says, sea elegans are usually found near the surface, are never more than half inch in size. They are not segmented. Okay, good information. Yes, for mine, I don't know. They tend to be all over. They're on the surface, they're on the bottom. Wherever the food scrap is, that is where I will find them in my bin. Oh, hi, Mom. How are you? It's been a while. Yeah, it's good to have you on the live. Yeah, so sometimes I don't really see them until when I harvest my castings and when I'm extracting the hatchlings, then I will see tons of them. But then there are some bins that they will just be all over the bin. So definitely I'm going to be trying that method to control them. So yes, I was asking if you guys feed your worms acidic food. And let's see. Russell says potworms are segmented like a worm, can grow to an inch in length, and are found in concentration at the bottom of the bin. Oh, okay. Yes, at the bottom of my bin, they tend to be concentrated in those regions for real. Yes, and they're white. For those who don't know what potworms look like, they're white and they look like little threads. So they're very thin. Yes. And sometimes, especially for new worm farmers, they may mistake the potworms for hatchlings, for the red wriggler or other hatchlings. But the thing about composting worms, red wriggler, Canadian night crawlers, African night crawlers, European night crawlers, whichever one, blue worms, they tend to gain their pigmentation or their color or start to get their color within 8 hours of hatching. So if you see them looking white and they're just constantly looking white, it means that they are not your composting worms, but they're actually potworms. I remember the first time I saw them and I was so excited. I'm like, oh my God, look at all these hatchlings. Yes, I think that was the first or the second year after I've had my worms, and they were I harvested in the fall, and then as I had the casting, I was using the light method where the worms move down and you scrape off the top. When I got to the bottom, that was the first time and the only time I've ever seen so many potworms. Honestly, I had more than a cup of potworms and I didn't know what they were. So I said, okay, I'm going to restart a bin with these worms. Yes, so I said I was going to restart a bin with them. So I put them in a bin and restarted the bin. And then I don't know if I did a video on it or if I was talking to someone about it and they said those are potworms. So I just throw them out into the garden. Yes, but I've never seen that many potworms even to this date, thankfully, because to have that many potworms is a lot. But then, considering the fact that they were harvested from a 4 by 4 compost bin, then I guess that is a small amount for that size bin, but that was a lot. But even to this date, even from those bins, I've never seen that volume, thankfully. But in those days, I used to put everything in the compost bin that I had the worms in. I would put acidic food because I didn't really know any better. So I would put the acidic food and everything else in there. Let's see. Russell says if you Google potworms, most pictures are of C. elegans. Okay. Okay. So what changes have you guys made to your worm bin since to your worm farm since you started worm farming? I've gone through quite a bit of change because when I first started out, it was just my compost bin, that 4 by 4 outdoor compost bin, because I started in July, so it was in the middle of summer. I started in that 4 by 4 outdoor bin, and then I gradually moved indoors for the winter, and then I started using these 76-liter totes. Man, were those ever heavy to handle. To lift those up, it was just, I still use a few of them, but it is bins, it's only for bins that I don't really have to move a lot. And I tend to harvest those a lot more often because it's can be heavy and even heavy. So even if the bin is just like a third full, I try to harvest it as quickly as possible because they can be difficult to handle. So some of the changes that I've gone through is that I still use the 4 by 4 in the summer, but then for the winter, I don't use those totes anymore. The African night crawlers and my Canadian night crawlers still use those totes because I don't really have to move the bin. I can tend to them where they are. But for my red wrigglers, I've now gone from totes to cement trays. And those I find they can be pretty heavy, even though they are much smaller. They can be very heavy, but they are much easier to handle. And then where building a shelf for them is, it's much easier to deal with because if you had to build shelves for all those worms that I have, and I was to put them in those large totes, then taking them down from high shelves could be dangerous. So that is some of the changes that I've gone through. When I moved my worms indoors first, for the first year, I used totes for the winter, and then the second year, I built myself one of those flow through bins. And I've never used the flow through system though. I built the bin, but that's as far as it goes. I raised the worms in there for the winter, and I like the bin. I really, really like the bin. It was doing pretty well. The only thing that I didn't like about it is the amount of space that it occupied, and then the size of the bin. I think I should have made two bins instead of one if I was going to use that system, because I made it. It was 4 feet high, but then the bottom 2 feet was just open space to extract the castings. So it was the actual bin was 2 feet high, which is cumbersome to bend over when the bin is already 4 feet high. And the next thing it's that it was 7 feet long, which was good, but then it was 4 feet wide and it was up against the wall. So I find that I couldn't really access the portion that is over against the wall. It was very tricky. So, and then as the worm population grew and I need more space, and there wasn't much space in the garage to build another. So I pulled that down and built the first worm shelf. Worked with that for I think a year or two. And then 2019, built the second shelf. So that has worked out for me so far. But guess what? I'm still out of space. Yeah, so now I noticed that last year, well, it's not last year, we're still in 2021. Yes, so in February, we had really, really bad weather. Temperatures went down in the minus 50s. So any bin that is about 18 inches from the ground up froze. So now I need to make some more adjustment to my worm shelf. So like when it is warm, I will use those lower shelves. But as the time gets colder, I'm going to have to move all those bins that are on the lower shelves and find somewhere to put them to keep them safe. And then for the shelf, the first shelf that I built, it is against the wall. Surprisingly, those bins froze. And the funny thing about it is that the heat is right next to it, but the heat was only shooting in the upper part of the shelf, but not the lower section. So anything that is resting against the wall froze, and anything that was on the lower shelves froze. So I'm going to have to make some adjustments where that is concerned. But it has come a long way. Even the very method of vermicomposting has changed, not just the containers that I raise them in. Because when I just started out, it was all food scraps. That's all they would get. There would be no bedding, nothing of the sort. Yes, I didn't even know that it needed bedding or that bedding was so important. I wasn't thinking about carbon source or anything like that. The whole purpose of it was just for the worms to eat my food scraps. But then as time goes by, I get to learn that bedding is really important in your worm bin. So those are some of the changes that has occurred. Back in those days, I used to have lots and lots of compost, or should I say food scraps. So I would just put the worms in those bins outside and the worms would just process it. But so now then I move on from feeding them just the food scraps to using bedding along with the food scraps. And then I moved on from that to feeding them just finished compost. I think this is the least effective way of feeding worms, because if you feed them just finished compost and you don't have any bedding in there, the compost tend to get compacted and the worms don't populate as much as with other feeding method. So it's not that it is bad to feed the worms compost, but if you're feeding the worms compost, it cannot be just compost. It has to have bedding. So you can feed them just compost with bedding, or you can feed them compost, food scraps, and bedding, or you can feed them food scraps and bedding. But whatever the case may be, it cannot be just finished compost because it just does not work. Yeah, so now I've moved on to a combination of food scraps, bedding, and compost. Um, to be honest, they get more compost with bedding than they do food scraps. The food scraps supply that I have is just my home, so it is spread thin at the moment. So still working on that. Yes, I'm still behind. I was thinking of getting some food scraps from a restaurant nearby. Still haven't contacted them yet. I'm just dreading the idea of being out there in the cold going to pick up the food scraps. So I'm hesitating, but I think I might have to get on that because I like to give them more food scraps. I do notice that when I feed my worms just the compost and when I feed them just food scraps, so neither of them has any bedding in them. So that is for where the food scraps alone is. That is when I just started out with the vermicomposting. The worms that are fed just the food scraps without the bedding, they are very fat and look very healthy and very nice. Their population grows a lot in comparison to the ones that are fed just compost. They're not as fat, they're not as big. Even if they're the same age, they're not the same size. They just, and they don't reproduce as much as the ones that are fed just the food scraps. So I don't know. I think the moisture play a big part in it, because I noticed that when worms have the right amount of moisture, they tend to be fatter. In fact, the fattest I've ever seen any composting worms are the composting worms that I used to have when I was doing, what's that, hydroponic garden. Because as long as your hydroponic garden is aerated, the worms can live in the water. So I added quite a bit of worms to my hydroponic system. And those worms, I have never seen worms so fat. And you know the funny thing about it? I didn't feed them. I just put them in the hydroponic system and they stay there and eat whatever leaves fall off from the trees above, or whatever fall off from whatever is growing in the hydroponic system. But I've never given them any food whatsoever. They were the fattest worms I've ever seen. Let's see. And why it says my worms mainly feed food scraps. Okay. I give them bedding. Okay. Yes, I know that when you just started off on white, you weren't even starting a worm farm. You were just starting a compost bin, and then the worms found it. And now you end up with worm bins galore. Yes, but I find the worms do love the compost, the food scraps, even without the bedding, they do, sorry, pretty well. But then the bedding provide the carbon that is beneficial for your plants. So, and the bedding is nice for the worms to have in there, and it helps to control the moisture too. So it's definitely worth it to have the bedding. So I've come a long way, and I still have a long way to go. One of the things that I like, in terms of the changes that I've made to my worm farm so far, is that it is getting more organized. So I'm pretty excited for that. Still not as organized as I would like it to be. It's taken me a while to get there, but I would say with each month I can see where I'm getting a little bit closer and closer. So someday I will be. Let's see, Russell says, my worm eat worm chow and compost and worm peat. Okay, okay. Yes, I was looking at some videos with some large scale worm farmers, and for some of them, they don't really feed their worms food scraps. And then there are those who feed their worms food scraps. So they will have like supermarkets and restaurants that supply them with large quantities. When they're hauling food from the restaurants or supermarket, it's truckload of food that they are carrying, hauling all at once. But whatever the case may be, as long as there is a balance and the worms are happy, that is what is important. So, do you make your own worm chow, Russell, or do you purchase worm chow? Let's see. And White says the fattest worms I have ever seen are the ones that found my finished compost slash garden box. They are immensely fat and healthy. Okay. Yes, I don't know. I think I'm going to try to imitate your method of raising your worm, your European night crawlers, and because I've seen photos of your worms, and so I've had those European night crawlers that you sent me for over 2 years now. I think maybe going three. Yeah, maybe about 2 years. Yeah, so I think it's 2 years. And they're nothing compared to the ones you've got. So I don't know why. I don't know if maybe because yours are in their native country, so they will do better, or what the case may be. But I still don't have the size that you've got. I don't know what's going on. And the funny thing is, I've seen quite a few different people raising these European night crawlers, and I've never seen any with the size that yours have. So I don't know what the story is. And that is why I tend to believe that it must be because they're still in their native country, why they're so big. Because everyone else that I see raising European night crawlers, nothing compared to the size that I see you with. So I think I want to try your method of raising them to see if maybe they will grow to that size or even close to it. Yes, definitely I'm going to try that your method, the method that you used when you just started seeing them in your box. So I'm going to definitely try that with some of them and see what happens. Let's see. Russell says, I make it. It is finely grounded chicken layer, 75%, and finely grounded and sifted rabbit pellets, 75%. Okay, okay. Let's see. And wife says it's because they get a lot of food scraps. Okay, well, I'll put that to the test and I'll make a bin and just give them a lot of food scraps and see what happens. If it's going to make them any fatter than the rest. Yeah, so far my worms mostly get the compost with the bedding. The European night crawlers, I must say, they do get more food scraps than the other worms because their bin is so big. So when I have a lot of food scraps and sometimes the food scraps starts to break down, so I'll just once it starts to break down to a certain extent, I would just throw everything in the European nightcrawler bin because the bin is so big. So they do get far more food scraps than all my other worms. And as you guys know, with the problem I was having with the mice, so I didn't really feed my worms food scraps unless I'm putting food in small containers and then putting it in their bins. So they didn't really get a lot of food scraps. But the European night crawlers, they definitely get a lot. So they should be fatter. Let's see. And says, I am still following the first method I started using. Okay, cool. So it's still a compost bin. So I take it that you feed them every day then? Like every time you have food scraps, you just go and put it in there. You don't store the food scraps elsewhere, right? So if you guys were to advise a new worm farmer, what advice would you give to someone who is new to worm farming? Okay, you feed them every other day. Okay. Um, I'm too lazy. Well, lazy would not be I don't think I can put lazy in a sentence with myself, but I don't think I could find the time to feed my worms daily or every other day. I don't even know if I would have time to feed my worms every week. That would be a lot of work because if worm farming was all that I do, then maybe, but finding the time to feed them every other day or once per week would be tedious. I do look after them once per week, but if I was to feed them once per week, I've got 70 bins. That's a lot. That's a lot to go through in a week. So to save myself some time, I just put everything, create the bin, and the bin is full from top to bottom. The bin is full, and however long it takes them to compose that material, the only thing I have to do in between is I don't put food scraps in there with everything else. I put the food scraps in containers. So every now and then I would have to top up those containers with food scraps. But apart from that, they have enough food where, as long as it takes them to compost it, they have food, so I don't have to feed them. So the only thing I would do each week is just to go out and aerate the bin and add moisture to it and put them back on the shelf, and that's it. And even that takes so much time. Yes, but yeah, I don't know if I would have the time to feed them that often. Hopefully, in the future, I will have a bigger space where I can set up my worm farm properly, and then I would like to have enough space where I have a room dedicated to European night crawlers. I have a room dedicated to Canadian night crawler, a room for the African night crawler. And I don't mind if the red wigglers and the European night crawlers are in the same room, because they pretty much require the same in terms of temperature. But if I could have a room for each of these worms where I can actually control the temperature to make each of them have the ideal temperature that they want, that is what I would like to accomplish in the future. So I'm going to make that as a goal, but I don't know when I'm going to accomplish it, if I'm going to accomplish it. But nothing tried, nothing done. So that is my goal. We'll see how that goes. Okay, you said yes, you put it in the bin whenever you've got it. Okay, yeah. So that is my goal for the future for my worm farm, to get each of these guys in their own separate location. Now, if I get myself set up where I can actually have a worm building like that, that would be awesome, because then I can definitely raise my Canadian night crawlers, because I think I would really love to raise the Canadian night crawlers. And the main reason why I would like to raise the Canadian night crawlers is because they are native to the region. So for fishing, they are the best fishing worms in terms of size, in terms of how long they will last, they will stay alive in the water. Because the African night crawlers definitely cannot be used for fishing here, because we don't go in the water. That is my family, not Canadians, but my family. We don't go in Canadian waters, or Saskatoon waters, I should say, not even on the hottest summer day, because when you put your foot in that water, it is no different from putting yourself in a freezer. It is freezing cold. So I know definitely the African night crawlers would not make good fishing bait. But the Canadian night crawlers, they can be in the water for a good while before they actually die. So I would really like to raise the Canadian night crawlers for fishing purposes. The other worms can be used for pet food or whatever, composting, whatever. But I would definitely love to raise the Canadian night crawlers. But at the moment, too much is required. Yes, and I also like to see my farm, my worm farm, organized to the point where I can track everything that I am doing with each type of worms, and with each bin for each type of worm. I'd really like to get myself organized to that point where I can track everything that is done to them. And these days I find myself, I'm trying to keep my records up, but I'm falling behind. So I'm trying to keep track of what bin I feed, when I restart whatever bin and stuff like that. But then sometimes I try to keep records on Wednesdays. Sometimes I am so busy that I don't get to do it that day. And if I don't get it to do it that day, it's not going to be done until the following week, because I just don't have the time. But then when the following week comes, sometimes I still cannot do anything. So it's kind of difficult to get everything organized, but I think I'll get there someday. With each day that passes, I'm a little bit closer. Yes, I was asking what advice would you give to someone who is either considering vermicomposting for the first time or just getting started. A lot of people, when you talk to them, sometimes you will hear them ask if it is difficult to do vermicomposting. A lot of them say that they really want to get involved, but they don't know what to do. And I think sometimes, based on their research, we might be guilty of making it seem more complicated than it needs to be. Yeah, because everybody have their different method of doing vermicomposting, and there may be a wrong way. If your worms are dying, then you're doing it the wrong way. But if your worms are not dying off, then you're not doing it the wrong way. So no matter what method you choose to do vermicomposting, as long as your worms are not dying off, then you're doing great. Yeah, so for new beginners or persons who are considering vermicomposting, keep it simple. Don't try to inculcate everything you hear about vermicomposting, because when it comes to vermicomposting, there are lots and lots and lots of information. So, my advice to anyone who is new and considering or just getting started in vermicomposting is to keep it as simple as you can. If as you grow and you gain more experience, you want to do more for your worms or for your worm farm, then go ahead. But if you're just getting started, don't try to inculcate everything that you hear about vermicomposting. The most important thing about vermicomposting is to have your worms, make sure they have bedding, make sure they have food, make sure you don't overfeed them, make sure they have enough moisture, make sure the bin is not acidic, make sure that the bin is getting enough airflow, and make sure that your worms have the right temperature. So it doesn't have to be the exact temperature, but make sure you keep them within the range that is suitable for them. And make sure that your bin is not too moist. As long as you are maintaining these conditions, and please don't forget to look after your worms. It is so easy, especially when you just get started in the first week or so. You're so excited for them that the chances of you forgetting about them is small. But then as time goes by, you might forget about them. So don't forget about your worms. Remember, they are there and you have to take care of them because they can't take care of themselves. But yes, vermicomposting is nothing that is difficult. People have used so many different methods. Each of these methods have worked. So find what works for you and stick to that.
Are you done?
No, I'm not finished. Yeah, so anyway, I am going to be saying goodbye to you guys. Yes, it was nice chatting with you. Your auntie is saying hi, my handsome nephew.
Hi. Can I?
Can you what?
Yes.
I'll give you some later.
Hmm.
No, don't play. It's not time to play now. Yeah, so I'm going to be saying goodbye to you guys. It was nice chatting with you. It was a nice discussion. So I hope you guys have a really wonderful weekend, that you will stay safe and that you will have fun with whatever it is that you're doing. And remember that no matter how hard things are, if you try to look on the bright side, try to see the positive in anything that you're doing, it will make life a little bit easier, make the difficulty a little bit easier to deal with. So stay safe, think positive, and I'll see you again on Monday, all being well. Okay, and before I go, I should let you know that on Friday, There won't be a live discussion because I'm going to be out of town. I will, however, try to put together some information for a video. Not sure how long it will be, so I will try to put together some information for a video that you guys can enjoy during the time that I would normally have the live. So until then, I hope you guys stay safe, and I'll see you on Monday.
You want to done?
Not quite.
No,
Not quite.
not yet.
No, I am.